that you have. We had some very good set of questions last week. Let's see. I'm going to, if you give me a question, I shall briefly summarize it for the camera. So, who'd like to kick off?
Is it really only the Catholic Church that seems to have the visions, rather than Christianity?
The question is it only in the Catholic Church that people have visions? It's a good question. I was talking to someone in the break who was from a Protestant background. We were talking a bit about this. I mean, visions, as I said last week, are there right from the beginning. So they're common to all Christians. In the Acts of the Apostles, there are quite a lot of visions, not just the famous one of St. Paul on the road to Damascus, but Peter and Paul and other apostles have visions. The last book of the Bible is one long vision. Someone asked me the question, when is the first apparition of Our Lady to anyone? And I have to say I don't know the answer to it. So I think that you have to answer a question like that in the context of the spiritual climate of the times. I recall a wonderful story told by a great communicator who I think was a Baptist. We never particularly advertised his religious affiliation, John Drain, a professor at Aberdeen. He came to give us a talk in a group I was in about 10 years ago, an ecumenical group in London, quite a big conference. And he began his talk by saying, well, I got on the train at York this morning intending to prepare my talk on the train. So I got interrupted, as you will hear, so I'm afraid what you're getting is spontaneous. So I got on the train, I opened my Bible, which is, don't ask me why, in the shape of a tin. And the man sitting next to me said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's a Bible. And I'm going to give a talk about angels and people who in the Bible who saw angels and what this means for people today." Whereupon the man sitting next to me, who was not a churchgoer at all, said, "That's very interesting. My wife's best friend sees angels." End of talk preparation, beginning of a 2-hour conversation about. And he began the talk basically by saying this as a challenge to us, sort of professional religious people, if you like. Are you aware, you clergy of the official churches, that there are many people out there who never go anywhere near a church, who think they've seen angels, for example, or who have visions of other heavenly beings? And do you take it seriously? His point was, that this is, rather than mocking something like that, as we might commonly do, we should actually take this as a sign of the times and reach out to people like this. So my answer to that would be, I think that a lot of people, and surveys, quite sociologically watertight surveys have been done, which show that many people actually have religious experiences in our society. I often tell the story, forgive me parishioners here, I've told it many times, I'm sure, of C.S. Lewis, who met the man who came back from the Second World War, where he'd been in the Egyptian desert. And he said in the vastness of the desert there, this man had an overwhelming experience of God. What exactly it was, I don't know. And Lewis, very eagerly said to him, and what difference did that make to you when you came back? Whereupon the man said, "Oh, I forgot all about it." More people have visions, religious experiences than we perhaps like to think. Some of you here may think that you have had them. Now, some of them may be maybe people who would be better put in St. Charles, the psychiatric ward, but some of them at least are people who perhaps have had genuine visions, who knows? So that would be my only... Among Protestants themselves, I have no idea what the answer would be, but I suspect it will be something along those lines. Yes?
If I can say something about probably the first vision.
If you're going to say it, would you like to come and... no, you can't talk to the camera, can you? Can he talk to the camera? No. But he needs the microphone, does he?
I can...
No.
I mean, you said the earliest one probably is the one to St. James in Saragossa, La Madonna del Pilar, which the Virgin appears when she's still alive.
Right.
To him. encouraging and, about the evangelism
Of Spain.
the Iberian Peninsula.
Oh, right.
So that's La Madonna del Pilar.
Mm.
Is the origin of that.
I didn't know that. There's a lot I don't know about visions, as you'll see.
I was wondering, some of the ones you explained earlier, it seemed as if there was only one encounter with Our Lady, is that right? And others, the visionaries have like more than one?
Yes, as the point I suppose I was making is that they vary. The question is,
How can you divide, this is the question really, how can you, if someone has one of, I've seen Our Lady, that must have been pretty intense, so that must have been slightly longer than something, because otherwise, I don't know, it just seems a bit strange, just by one person saying, one time I've seen something.
Okay. So the question is really, what about people who just have one, perhaps a short vision? How can we believe that? It must be very intense. Well, all I can say is I think that if you have such a vision, and if it's a genuine one, it has a profound effect on you. It's not like anything else. If it's, we all have an imagination, and I'll speak a bit about this next week. We can all, St. Ignatius teaches us to use the imagination, for example, to picture a scene in the Bible. So, you might picture the Annunciation in your imagination. You might shut your eyes, and you might, if you're artistic, you might draw it. And it can have a very profound effect. The whole point is that the imagination, using the imagination, can change your behavior and your attitudes. But when people have visions that are genuine, whether they're officially approved or whether it just appears that they are genuine, we're talking about something quite different. We're talking about something quite objective actually happening to them, as if, we were transported back to the time of Jesus or Our Lady and actually met them and spoke to them. So, I think all one can say is to repeat what I've said before, that the form of visions varies enormously. Sometimes Our Lady appears several times. In Fatima, of course, she appeared on the 13th of the month, every time from May to October. Lourdes, she appeared, I don't remember how many times, but certainly 6 or 7 times to Bernadette, 3 times to Catherine Labouré. On other occasions, she appeared only once and spoke, as in La Salette. On other occasions, she says absolutely nothing. She presumably has the wisdom to know what effect, what she needs to do to achieve the desired effect on the particular person. I think that's all one can really say. Jeremy.
People often know a little bit about some of the apparitions, maybe Fatima, obviously Lourdes and everything, but very little about the dogmas. And so, and Rudbach and Lourdes sort of bookend the Immaculate Conception. And then going into the 20th century, there's virtual complete illiteracy with regard to how things progress theologically after the Immaculate Conception, which sort of make it harder for us to understand what Mary is saying in at Amsterdam with the Kita, and even say Kibeno with the Dollar Rosary that isn't very widely practiced, I think. So it seems like there's a whole separate story that is connected to all these apparitions.
Yes. The question is about the connection between Marian apparitions and Marian dogma, something that you're quite right, I haven't really explored and we need to think a bit about. Of course, the connection that immediately comes to mind is the final apparition to Saint Bernadette in Lourdes, where she finally gets round, because often Our Lady, when she appears, she doesn't sort of say, "Hey, I'm Our Lady." She appears just as a beautiful woman. People have their suspicions. Eventually, Bernadette gets round to asking, say, "Well, if you don't mind me asking, who are you?" And she smiles and says in Basque dialect, "I am the Immaculate Conception," which, of course, was a dogma which had been believed in and practiced by the Church. And in fact, there was a feast of the Immaculate Conception, but never actually been solemnly defined. I think, was it solemnly defined 4 years after or 4 years before? 4 years before, that's right. And again, given that Bernadette was pretty illiterate, it's not very likely that she would know much about the Immaculate Conception. Very interesting in terms of Our Lady of Amsterdam, which I'll speak about next week, is that is very strongly linked to the desire that some people have for the proclamation of is it a fourth or a fifth Marian dogma, that Our Lady is co-redeemer and mediatrix of all graces. A dogma that I'm almost certain Pope John Paul II believed in, but probably considered it inopportune to declare on ecumenical grounds or all sorts of reasons. So one has to remember, and I'll look at this in more detail next week, that even when Our Lady says something very, very clearly, it's not always easy for her to be obeyed. In Fatima, she asked for the world, and especially for Russia, to be consecrated to her sacred heart, to her Immaculate Heart and Sorrowful Heart. This took a very, very long time to do, and when Pope John Paul II finally did it, and I'll say more about that next week, so I don't want to go into it too much here, he didn't actually explicitly mention Russia for fairly obvious reasons. This is a mystery, really, of apparitions. Read the diary of St. Faustina, and you will see Jesus is frequently asking her to say and do things which her confessor then says, "You must not do this." And Jesus then says to her, "Obey your confessor." There's a paradox here. I suppose it's part of the education of the visionary themselves, that the Church has always taught that obedience is better than some extraordinary act, even in the case of where you're sure you've received an apparition. If your confessor tells you it's not to be relied on, it doesn't mean you don't believe the apparition, but it does mean you sort of exercise caution about it. So there's a kind of interesting spiritual interval. I thank you for that. I'll try and deal with that a bit more next week, because I think it's a question worthy of, until of course the current request for a fifth dogma, the things that Our Lady has revealed have been commonly believed anyway. I mean, the Church believed in the Assumption and the Immaculate Conception long before they were defined. So Our Lady's message on the whole has not been so much about doctrine, but about practice, and particularly, of course, in Fatima, the Rosary, and in other apparitions. The Rosary really is central to Marian apparitions. Yes, and then. Yeah.
Why do you think it's Mary who appears in apparitions and not, for instance, Joseph or other?
Why does Mary appear in apparitions and not Joseph? That's I suppose, as for Catholics, we see Our Lady as having an absolutely central role in salvation as a channel. You know, even on a human level, your mother is the one through whom you received life, and your relationship with your mother is so fundamental. You know, nothing else is like it, for good or for ill, of course, in different ways. And we must assume that, I think, for Jesus, divine as he is, this is the same as well. That it pleases God to give Mary an absolutely central role. Protestants, and I speak as an ex-Protestant myself, and often have a certain, anything ranging from a mild distaste to a virulent hatred of the whole idea of Mary and the saints having a role in salvation. Sometimes, though, that is justified on the idea, on the pretext that it somehow takes away from God's glory to that he should use someone like Mary. Of course, when you think about it, exactly the reverse is the case. How could the glory of God be shown more, or the power of God be shown more powerfully, than that he chose a 14, 15-year-old uneducated woman in an absolute backwater of the church, at a time when women were completely downtrodden, that he worked through her. I mean, it just shows the immense power of God to an enormous degree, that he could save the world, basically, by becoming flesh through her. And I think St. Louis de Montfort makes this point, of many other Marian teachers, is that just as God saved the world, just as God became incarnate, just as he came into the world the first time through Mary, so he will come into the world a second time through her. This is not something you have to believe. It is a point which seems to make a lot of sense, though. That it seems to make sense that she would be given in God's economy, if you like, a very powerful role in preparing the world for his second coming.
Yeah, you said about this sort of indifference you had about Mary being Protestant. I noticed that myself with Jehovah's Witnesses and things like that. But I notice in Islam they have very great respect for Mary. In fact, she's the only named woman in the Quran.
Yes.
And she's held up as a righteous woman.
Yes.
And, in fact, she's mentioned more times in the Quran than she is in the New Testament.
It's very interesting. Another point which I'll elaborate on next week is, of course, is that Fatima itself is a link between Christianity and Islam. Fatima in Portugal owes its name to the Prophet Muhammad's daughter. I think, if I'm right in saying that Muhammad was unable or didn't actually have any sons who survived. However, he had a very, very beloved daughter, and I'll get the story right for next week, but a Portuguese nobleman married a Muslim woman, if I've got it right, and they had a daughter who the woman named Fatima. I think the woman then converted to Christianity, if I remember. The Fatima died and was buried, and he buried her in a place where modern Fatima is, and he named it Fatima after her. So Fatima in Portugal is actually named after the Prophet's daughter. I think that has to be significant, because again, one of the key challenges of our time that I'm sure Our Lady wants to address is the relationship between Christianity and Islam.
Does Our Lady appear in the race of the country where she appeared, or is she? How does that work?
Does Our Lady appear in the race of the country that she? Well, certainly in Guadalupe, she did. She appeared as a sort of Mexican peasant woman, I suppose. She spoke to Bernadette in the dialect of the Basques. How did she appear in? We don't know. Jean has told us that he was actually in Egypt when Our Lady appeared, though he didn't see her. But how did she appear in Quibejo? Was she black? She was black. Yeah. Yes. Yes. The bodies of the saints, of course, like the body of our Lord after the resurrection, are glorified bodies. So they are completely at our command. Just like, well, I suppose in a sense, angels obviously have no bodies, but they can appear, if they take a bodily form, they can appear in whatever form they're meant to take. I think we have to assume that a glorified saint can do whatever they want with their body. A wonderful thought, isn't it, that I could, suddenly make my skin dark brown if I wanted to when my body is glorified.
I was just going to say, I know about St. Catherine Labouré and St. Bernadette, that they both are incorrupt. They're both in God's providence.
Aha.
St. Catherine Labouré in Uruguay and Bernadette in Nevada. But I just wonder if that's common for other receivers of apparitions.
Interesting that the bodies of two of the visionaries mentioned, Catherine and Bernadette, are incorrupt. I mean, this is something which is a sign of sanctity, but not by any means a guaranteed sign. There are plenty of extremely saintly people. One thinks especially, for example, of Saint Therese of Lisieux, whose bodies are decayed as far as we know. So incorruption, I don't think, is a sign of sanctity, but I don't think it's particularly linked to, I suppose it could be, I don't know, I'll have to, I've never looked into that. Let's think about that. Who else could we examine? I don't think Maxim and Melanie are probably, sorry? Well, Padre Pio does, although I'm sure Padre Pio had visions in the lines that I spoke about earlier, but he's not one of these visionaries, so to speak. Is she incorrupt? Is she? Well, there you are. We might be onto something here, but I'm afraid it's not something I've investigated. Any more questions or comments? Yes?
Comment that we do have somebody in local cemetery that's connected to Walsingham.
Local?
That's connected to Walsingham.
Oh yes, we do indeed. In fact, you'll see, hopefully you should be noticed in our church that there's a mass, I think, in April for Charlotte Boyd. This is a very... Charlotte Boyd was probably the main mover and shaker in the revival of the Catholic shrine in Walsingham in, when was it, 1930 something? I can't remember exactly when. Sadly, she is not buried there. She's buried at Kensal Green Cemetery. And many people, I think, would like, in fact, I was speaking to the Bishop of East Anglia a month or so ago, and there's quite a move to have her body transferred to the Slipper Chapel at Walsingham. There's one or two complications, because the best place for her to go is currently occupied by a bishop who who shouldn't have been there in the first place. He should have been in the cathedral in Norwich, but the civil authorities wouldn't allow. So it's a complicated case, but we're hoping very much that she will be reinterred in Walsingham at some date. I think it would be very symbolic and important. Yes?
I'm just amazed about the meaning of what Luther just explained to us. I can't believe that. I mean, God doesn't really name the countries, does he?
Sorry?
I said I'm just amazed about the
God,
meaning
of the word Guadalupe. I think it's not absolutely certain, but it's one quite valid interpretation of the word Guadalupe. I've forgotten where I got it from, so I can't back it up at the moment. But
it's really amazing. Bethlehem, house of bread. I was really blown over when I heard the meaning of it.
That definitely means house of bread. Yes.
Really named those places. There's probably other places that.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yes.
Can I ask something? Could you tell me a little bit more about, the Rosary, Our Lady appearing to St. Dominic?
A question of Our Lady was...
I'm just saying that the Rosary is so special to her.
Yes.
And I'd like to know a little bit more about it.
The question concerns whether Our Lady revealed the Rosary to St. Dominic. It has to be said this is somewhat disputed. I mean, probably a strict historian will say that there is no strict evidence that the Rosary owes its origin to an apparition of Our Lady to St. Dominic. It's what one might call a pious tradition, which you're certainly free to believe. The story goes that Dominic, as you probably know, was involved in fighting a particularly virulent heresy at the time, the Albigensian heresy, which was ravaging that part of France in the 13th century. And he tried all sorts of methods, sort of preaching, the Inquisition, sort of violent methods. And none of them worked, and the heretics remained completely unconvinced. And he's said to have had a vision. He's said to have gone, I think, into a forest for about 3 days to fast and pray, and had this vision of Our Lady in which the Rosary... The Rosary was, to some extent, in existence already. The Rosary, of course, the origin of the Rosary really is, it's like, it grew gradually. It took its present form even after St. Dominic's time. But the idea of saying the the first half of the Hail Mary, which is basically the salutation, the greeting of the Archangel Gabriel, was there already. And the 150 Hail Marys of the 15 decades of the Rosary was the equivalent of the 150 Psalms. There are 150 Psalms. Monks, priests, those who were able to read, were supposed to say probably the entire Psalter every week. Some monasteries still do that. It's now divided in the breviary more, a bit easier than that. But you were supposed to say the 150 Psalms. Poor people, ordinary people, in those days couldn't read, so that they can't do that. So what do? They say 150 Hail Marys. That's how the Rosary really took its shape. So there was something of the Rosary there. And in this vision that Dominic is said to have had in this forest, Our Lady sort of showed him the Rosary and said, you know, the methods you've tried so far to convert the heretics aren't going to work. Try the sweetness, the gentleness of this. And she held it out to him. Now that is, who knows whether it actually, what exactly happened. The documents aren't terribly strong on it, but there's certainly a tradition that he, certainly if he didn't receive it in that way, he certainly promulgated it and used it in his preaching to great effect, and found that it did indeed have great effects. And I suppose it's the beginning of the whole tradition that the Rosary has power. This came up last week, someone mentioned it. I think, was it you who said that what someone said in their childhood, you know, the Rosary seemed something rather frightening because it was to do with sort of, you know, fighting hell and demons. There is a more positive interpretation of that, the Battle of Lepanto, where the people said the Rosary to defeat the Turks. The bishop we had in the cathedral last year, Bishop Dome from Nigeria, who again had a vision of Jesus handing him the sword, which turned into a rosary to defeat Boko Haram. So it's the idea that the Rosary has power. You know, the prophecy in Genesis 3:15 is that Mary will crush the head of the serpent. She gives us the Rosary so that power is in our hands, because behind so many of the distressing events in the world, though we can't see it, is the power of unseen spiritual forces. As St. Paul says, you know, we fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. Enough for this week?
Yes, sir.
Thank you all very much. See you next week, I hope.